everyone, this is Lomi, and today I'm starting work on my new version of Catania, which is the Feeple65 CN I got secondhand earlier this year. This doll came to me needing a few repairs, such as stain removal and needing a chip in her wrist taken care of. She's also in need of restringing, so the first step in this doll's maintenance is taking her apart. Feeple65s are really weird. It's easy to tell from how modular they are, with arms and lower legs that can be removed without restringing the doll, that Fairyland intended to offer fantasy parts for them and then just never did. I sort of hope, since there's been a renewed interest in this size of doll, that they'll do more with it at some point. You can see this doll is pretty loose from how easily her thigh pulls out from her hip, so hopefully a restringing helps remedy that. But while I have the doll apart for restringing and cleaning, I'm also going to make a small change to the engineering. My friend Una modified her Feeple65 to improve her ability to sit, and I was totally jealous, so I figured since Kit already has minor damage, it makes her a perfect candidate for experimentation. The hip joint on this doll has a locking feature, but the torso is always a little tilted back, because the corner of the hip socket doesn't let the leg move quite as far as it should. So this is a super minor change, just shaving maybe a millimeter or two off the outer edge of the hip socket. That tiny change is all it takes to move the body more upright. The other part that's getting changed is lengthening the string slot in the thigh by about 1/4 inch, because the way it is now, the slot isn't quite centered to where the elastic actually comes down through the torso, which makes the doll more likely to pitch backwards due to excess string tension. This will make it line up better when the doll is sitting. To alter the edge of the hip socket, I use a sanding wheel on my Dremel set to low speed. It ended up being really fast and so simple that I was convinced I was doing it wrong and messed something up. I smoothed out the edges with 600 grit sandpaper, evened up a few spots, and then checked the hip piece to see how it went together. The fit was great, but I was a little conservative on the corner of the hip, so I rounded that out a little more, and that was it. It changed very little, didn't affect the doll's ability to stand, improved her ability to sit, and hardly altered the look of the hip joint at all. For the thighs, I used a multi-purpose cutting bit, which looks a lot like a drill bit with the spiral flared out a little more. I always find these cut well, but can be a bit hard to control. It goes right through the resin, but I didn't get it very straight, so my edges are a little rougher than I hoped for on the first one. But overall, I don't think it'll be too noticeable. I tried a regular drill bit on the second leg, but found the bit wasn't long enough to go through to the string channel, so even though I tried really hard, I had to resort to using the cutting bit anyway, because it just wouldn't go through. A longer drill bit obviously wouldn't have this problem. The branded Dremel ones are just really weirdly short. So after I finished carving the second thigh, once again, I finished the job with a light sanding using 600 grit sandpaper. Next up was a bath. The worst of the staining on this doll was on her backside, and after I inspected it, I was pretty sure it would come off with some magic eraser. So I dunked the doll into warm water in one of my doll project pots and set to scrubbing. I turned out to be right, and the staining scrubbed off pretty easily. I don't like using melamine sponges too frequently, because it is a form of micro sanding, and too much scrubbing can change the texture of the resin over time. But for general maintenance and occasional heavy-duty cleanup, it's great. I scrubbed the whole body, then it was time to restring. The neck mechanism ended up being really difficult to get the new elastic through, so I first threaded a loop of a shoelace through the hook and put the elastic through that loop. Then I was able to pull it through, though it took a lot more strength than I expected it would. I had some concerns about the elastic I was using since it came with Laylee, my Applehouse new YID, and it was a bit thinner than the elastic kit was originally strung with. I'm not sure how it'll perform, but I'll give it a try because it's all I have right now. After I tied the knot, it ended up being about 4 inches shorter than the old elastic that she'd come with, so it should resolve the looseness just fine. I shifted the elastic so the knot would fall inside the doll's torso, and that way it won't interfere with stringing the legs. Then it was time to put her back together. Because the F65 is probably the weirdest doll I've ever had to restring, with her really weird modular mechanics, she's not a good one to share as any kind of restringing guide. I also only have one pair of the locking pliers, so I ended up using a pencil to hold the elastic in her other hip, and that was awful because it marked everything it touched. And on top of that, because her jointing is so bizarre, I ended up having to hold her torso between my thighs to get the 2 knee pieces in. It was probably the most difficult and awkward experience I've ever had in restringing a doll, so hopefully this elastic works well for her and I won't have to redo it for a long time. At the very least, before I try again, I need to get back out to Harbor Freight and buy a second pair of the locking pliers, because they cost all of like $4, and I should have gotten 2 to begin with, but I wasn't sure they would be sturdy enough for this kind of work. Getting the split ring back onto the elastic for the knee took a pair of needle nose pliers, but that was one of the easier parts of the job. After that, it was just a matter of hooking her legs back on and popping in her arms. But there's still that chip to fix, so I have to tackle that. I put her hand back on to help me lift the wrist joint out of the socket so I could slide in some plastic film. Then it's time for the epoxy clay. I use white milliput and a silicone sculpting tool, as well as my fingers dipped in water, to press epoxy into the chip, smooth it out, scrape off extra, smooth it out. There'll probably be a difference in thickness here no matter what I do, because the epoxy has to have enough surface to attach to, which means it has to extend past the edges of the chip and onto the arm, at least a little bit. But it's not too bad, and it doesn't take long to get it nicely shaped. Once it's had a chance to cure overnight, I sand it with a 240 grit sanding sponge and then 600 grit sandpaper to even everything out. It makes this side of the wrist slightly thicker and it's a little raised, but I don't think it'll be super noticeable once it's painted. After the sanding job is complete, I mix a nice skin tone match for her resin using Vallejo acrylic paint. For this particular match, I used 7 drops of white, 1 drop of basic skin, and 1 drop of flat flesh. Acrylic always goes on a shade lighter than it'll look when it's dry, so it's a little bright at first, but dries to a perfect match. Once it's dry, I coat it with some Mr. Super Clear to seal the job. After that, once I put the doll's arm back on, I feel like the end result is pretty good. The patch hardly shows at all, and that means all this girl's body repairs and modifications are now complete. The next thing to plan for is her eye-opening modification, unless someone out there decides to sell me an open-eyed faceplate in the next week or so. That's all for today though. Thanks for watching. Bye.